Welcome, everybody. We're going to start up with a little bit of trivia. It's one of my favorite parts of the little call, so this is exciting. How did transitions start? Anybody know? Oh, we're going to learn so much today. This is exciting. I'm so glad to have Don on this call. So it started as an energy action plan, which is pretty exciting with Rob and his students over in Ireland, which is in the UK, came over here, and I'm excited to learn so much about this today. Actually, this has been kind of a playground for me. Let's go ahead and get started. Amy, are you all ready? Yeah, excellent. Okay, hello and welcome to Sustainable Kashi's free permaculture class. We're really excited to be able to offer these classes to help us all to connect with each other and the ecosystem using permaculture as our foundation. So it's really nice to connect in this time of COVID to be able just to see each other's faces and share our stories. Sustainable Kashi is located in Sebastian, Florida. We're on an 80-acre retreat center on the beautiful St. Sebastian River. If you've never been able to come see us, I highly recommend you get a chance to come out and tour. We have 9 demonstration gardens, each with different growing styles, where we show you what you can grow here in Florida. We have an off-grid eco-village with regenerative energy systems that you can get your hands on systems that really work and create regenerative energy. So that's really exciting, and I do hope you get a chance to come out and see us. We're going to start with a little participation section, and you can either raise your hand, you can hit the space bar, and that will unmute you so everybody can hear you, and then when you let go of the space bar, it will remute you. And the question is, who can share your experiences with the transition movement? Nancy? All right, we have a newbie, so none, that's good. Yes, Amy.
My only experience with the transitions is setting up this class. So I'm that's a newbie, completely newbie.
That's pretty good. That's pretty.
Namaste, Terry Hahnemann. It's Kali.
Hi, Kali. It's so good to hear your voice.
And you as well. I'm letting you know that I have absolutely zero experience and knowledge. So just thought I'd let you know.
Perfect. And that is, you are in the absolute right place at the right time to learn. So that's fantastic. So good to hear your voice.
You too. Thank you for doing this.
Mm-hmm. All right. This is such an introduction into the transitions movement. This is great. I have personally, I was involved in the Transition Orlando movement. That was my first introduction to it. And I was so excited. And I quickly saw that transitions and permaculture had so much in common. And basically they're spokes of the same wheel. And the interesting part is that they're both just tips of the iceberg of this large concept. And people think of permaculture as this agricultural science or way to grow a bunch of plants. And of course, it's so much more than that, with a social and economic, and it really just touches pretty much every aspect of our lives. And I noticed that transitions had that same holistic approach, which was really, really cool. And to see a whole separate movement doing the same things, and I really just saw ways we could share tools and really interact with each other in a wonderful way. We're so lucky today to have Don Hall, who's a certified transitions trainer, an experienced facilitator. I mean, he's been doing this over a decade, dedicated to the transition towns movement and dedicated to helping people reconnect. And it's been an inspiration to see you doing this work for so very long, Don. So thank you so much for being here. And I would like to introduce Don Hall.
Great. Wonderful to be here with you all. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. There we go. So today I'm not only going to be speaking as a leader in the International Transition Towns movement, which, as Terry said, I've been doing for the last 12 years. I started out with Transition Colorado, the first official transition initiative in North America. Moved back home in 2010 to start Transition Sarasota. Did that from 2010 to 2016. And in 2017, I became co-director of Transition US, the national hub for the International Transition Towns movement. But I'm also speaking here as somebody who is a permaculture designer and practitioner. I took my permaculture design course back in 2008 at the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute in Basalt, Colorado. At that time, I was living in Boulder, Colorado. And I've been practicing permaculture ever since, both in the way that people typically think of permaculture, in terms of growing one's own food in a sustainable and ecological fashion. I've grown gardens every year for the last 12 years. I currently live in an intentional community that I founded here in Sarasota called the Novus Community House. We have about 20 different kinds of fruit trees in our front yard. Our ground cover is a mix of sweet potatoes and Puerto Rican black beans. We do rainwater catchment. We have solar hot water. We keep chickens. We turned our pool into a pond with lots of aquatic plants and goldfish and koi. So I'm very much here with you. And the main point of this presentation is to tell you a little bit about the Transition Towns movement, because I'm aware that a lot of people are not that familiar. And also to talk about how transition and permaculture, like Terry was saying, are very close kin. In fact, the transition movement emerged from permaculture. It was started by a permaculture teacher back in 2005, and to encourage us to collaborate more with each other. That I think particularly in these very uncertain times, where we're not only grappling with a global pandemic and a legacy of racism and systemic oppression, but we also know that we're dealing with increasing impacts from global climate change. That we need to work together, not just transition and permaculture, but all the many movements for social justice and environmental sustainability that we see in the world today. We need to become more and more intersectional, I think. So I've given this presentation actually before at the Florida Permaculture Convergence, at the Northern California Permaculture Convergence, where this picture was taken, and the North American Permaculture Convergence that was held there. Because I think that this is a really important topic, and that the connection between the transition and permaculture movements is pretty unique. So I'll try to keep this somewhat brief so that we have plenty of time for questions. I'm going to start off here by just talking about what is transition. So we say that we are a movement of communities coming together to reimagine and rebuild our world. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot view. But what do we really mean by that? Transition, like permaculture, can be explained in many different ways. But perhaps the simplest way for this group is to talk about what it shares in common and what it has, how it's different from permaculture. So What it shares in common with permaculture are the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. Many of the same design principles that have been described by the permaculture founders, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, and the same holistic approach, as Terry was saying, addressing all the different petals of the permaculture flower, from land and nature stewardship, building, tools and technology, education and culture, health and spiritual well-being, finance and economics, land tenure and community governance. So just as permaculture looks at our whole society, how can we have a truly regenerative society? So does the Transition Towns movement. The difference here is mainly one of emphasis. So I think we've seen historically in permaculture that the emphasis has been mostly on the homestead or farm scale. Not exclusively, of course. There have been lots of brilliant permaculturalists out there doing brilliant systems changing work. But most has focused on growing food, fiber, and fuel in a very sustainable way in harmony with nature. Whereas the transition movement has primarily focused on the scale of a town, city, community. And how do we make our systems of food, energy, economy, healthcare, transportation, education, etc., truly sustainable and just? And that doesn't mean that transitioners aren't also, growing gardens and catching rainwater and tending animals and so forth. So I think that these two movements are very complementary and also very overlapping. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what transition is, but I want to go a little bit deeper and tell the transition story from the beginning and give you some examples of what transition actually looks like. So transition started in 2005 in Kinsale, Ireland, where Rob Hopkins, who's the happy guy in the green shirt in the picture here, was teaching a 2-year course in practical sustainability at Kinsale Further Education College. And this was about the time that a lot more attention started being paid to climate change. Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth had just come out. And although we might, be kind of skeptical about that now, it sent a major shockwave through the world at a time. It really increased consciousness. And people were also learning about this thing called peak oil that I'm not going to talk so much about here because we've seen the situation shift over the last 15 years where we have moved from conventional sources of oil, drilling in the ground, to unconventional sources such as fracking and tar sands and deep water drilling increasingly. That has made the concept of peak oil mostly irrelevant. But at the time, they were very concerned about both climate change and peak oil and decided to create a plan for their community, which is what you see here, Kinsale 2021, an Energy Descent Action Plan. And so what they did was they looked at their community. They looked at every aspect of their community, all those petals of the permaculture flower. and said, where are we right now in 2005? Where would we like to be in 2021 using half as much oil? And how do we get there? What do we do every year? What do we need to do every year to get there? To have a thriving community in the year 2021. And this was a student project, so they didn't think a whole lot of it at the time. But after it was posted online and it was unanimously adopted by the Town Council of Kinsale, Ireland, word started to spread of this new approach to organizing. And people started asking Rob, how do we do this in our community? And he had to say, I have no idea, because I did this in very special circumstances with a very supportive, well-established academic institution. I don't know how you do this in a normal community. I don't know how you start this from scratch. So he decided to move in 2006 with his family to a small town in the southwest of England called Totnes with his family to prototype the Transition Towns process and also do a PhD in resilience studies. And Transition Town Totnes, their early actions really set a template for all the transition initiatives to come. So I'm going to give you some examples of a few things that they accomplished in just the first couple of years of Transition Town Totnes. And I think this shows, the kinds of things that transition initiatives can do in the early stages. So they started off by founding an initiating group, a small group of people committed to shepherding this initiative through the early stages. They started training people in the skills that would be needed to realize a transition or permaculture vision. They taught permaculture classes. They called this work the Great Reskilling, learning do-it-yourself sustainable living skills, not only how to grow food, but also how to make decisions collectively and resolve conflicts. So really looking at the head, the heart, and the hands of transition, as we say. They hosted big community discussions to receive feedback and input from their community and to encourage people to take action using open space technology, using World Cafe, different methodologies like that. This was a discussion that they held on how can Totnes feed itself beyond the age of cheap oil. They started practical projects, practical manifestations of their ideas, such as this fruit and nut tree planting project, where they planted hundreds of fruit and nut trees throughout their local community, which was supported by their town council and mayor, here seen in the big bling and the shocking pink coat. They do things a little different over in England. They partnered with lots of different organizations. Here is a program working with the local businesses called Oil Vulnerability Auditing, encouraging businesses to conserve more energy, become more energy efficient, and prepare for a time when we are using much less fossil fuels. They created their own local currency to keep wealth circulating within their local community. This is a currency that can only be spent at local businesses. So they can't be spent at big corporations where that money typically goes back to corporate headquarters to enrich executives and continue to exacerbate wealth inequality. They held what they called a great unleashing. And they did many public awareness raising programs. This one was attended by about 10% of their entire town. So there was a very large portion of their community that was behind it. And they did other things like working with local school kids to develop positive stories from the future in a project called Transition Tales. And worked with youth and elders in many different ways. So this was just about the first 2 years of Transition Town Taught-ness. So you can see why there were so many people who were interested in copying their approach. And other nearby towns did. And their experiences were collected into this book that was published in 2008 called The Transition Handbook, which was a bestseller and spread transition around the world. And in it, Rob talks a lot about permaculture. He cites it as his primary inspiration for creating the Transition Towns movement. He said that one of the principal foundations of the transition concept is permaculture. When designing the transition that our settlements and communities will inevitably have to undertake, we need a design template. Permaculture can be thought of as the design glue and the ethical foundations we use to stick together all the elements of a post-peak settlement. And he has continued to promote permaculture through a lot of his talks and writings over the past 12 years since, making sure that transitioners know that this is, that permaculture underpins the entire transition approach. And in our application to become recognized as an official transition initiative here in the United States, we encourage everyone to take a permaculture design course because we strongly believe that the knowledge and training that you get in a PDC will make you a better transition organizer. So since the publication of the Transition Handbook, transition movement has spread all over the world, over 1,000 communities in more than 50 countries, mostly concentrated in Western Europe and North America, as you can see here, but also in South America, Central America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East. So people doing transition in all sorts of different kinds of contexts. And the model has adapted and evolved to those various contexts. Transition initiatives are encouraged to reflect the needs and desires of their local communities, not to follow entirely cookie cutter approach. And the transition approach, as a result, has evolved over the years. And so before I go on to talking about recommendations for how permaculture and transition can collaborate more with each other, I want to share with you some of the greatest accomplishments of transition initiatives around the world, so you can kind of see what's possible and maybe kind of stoke the imagination about what could be possible. And this is a big theme in the transition movement. Since the very beginning, we've talked about the importance of the imagination, the importance of envisioning positive futures, envisioning that we could actually win, that we could actually create a truly sustainable society. And you know, that permaculture and transition could be the norm rather than the exception. Rob Hopkins' latest book is called From What Is to What If, using the power of the imagination to transform the world. And I agree that if we can't at least imagine it, chances are we will never get there. So here's some examples. In Bristol, one of the largest cities in England, they created a local currency that is particularly notable in that hundreds of local businesses accept it. The mayor formally took his whole salary in Bristol pounds. You can use it to pay your taxes and ride the bus, and it's available in ATMs throughout the city. So talking about mainstreaming a really powerful economic innovation. We also have Transition Town Brixton, which is based in historically very diverse and vibrant neighborhood of London. And here the transition group started Brixton Energy, which raised millions of pounds, British dollars, in investment from ordinary people. Sometimes, $50, a few $100 at a time, sometimes more, to purchase large solar photovoltaic arrays and install them on public housing. So these arrays are owned by the community, decentralized, and go to benefit low-income residents and help bring down their electricity bills. In Liège, in Belgium, a transition group there started a network called Centre Alimentaire. Any French speakers can tell me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But it's a network of local food cooperatives. And to date, they've launched about 20 worker-owned farms and other related businesses in their region. And they're all working together, where the farms supply the grocery stores and the restaurants. And they're building a whole local food economy there. Moving here to the US, we have initiatives like the Victory Garden Initiative that was originally spawned by Transition Milwaukee, which is now planted over 4,000 gardens in every neighborhood throughout their city. And I think of fleet farming, and I love fleet farming. I think it's beautiful. But I think of all the national attention they got for planting a couple dozen gardens. And here they've planted 4,000 gardens throughout their city. In Sarasota, the transition initiative I started, Transition Sarasota, is most famous for our Suncoast Gleaning Project, which has harvested and donated over 350,000 pounds of local organic produce now from local farms for the food insecure in our community, distributed through local food banks. In Port Townsend, Washington, the transition initiative there, Local 2020, started over 10 years ago a local investing opportunities network. Encouraging people to take their money out of Wall Street and put it into local businesses that they know and believe in. And so over $7 million has now been invested into these businesses, a lot of them local food businesses, such as farms and a cidery, bicycle repair shop. This is a picture of a 21 plus movie house in their town that received some funding. And they've become a model for similar local investment networks all over the world. It's called the Local Investment Opportunities Network, also known as LION. In Totnes, where it all started, they've moved on to even bigger projects. This one is called Atmos Totnes. And it is taking an abandoned factory site in the center of town and turning it into a mixed-use hub for affordable housing and sustainable businesses. And in Ungersheim, in France, they are seeking to become the world's first transition village, launching more than a dozen projects throughout their town with the full support of their mayor and all the resources of their local government. So I think that gives you a bit of an idea of what might be possible here in terms of scaling up our approaches to create a truly regenerative society. So before we go to questions, I'm just going to put out a few ideas for collaboration that maybe we can discuss further. Maybe you have your own ideas. You know, first off, to learn from each other. You know, I've been a keen student of permaculture for the last 12 years, permaculture design courses, taking many permaculture workshops, reading most everything that David Holmgren's ever written, Toby Hemingway, other folks like that. You know, check out Transition. There's a free downloadable guide on the Transition US website called The Essential Guide to Doing Transition. That's an excellent place to start. There's a couple films that are available for free online. In Transition 1.0, In Transition 2.0. They're both pretty out of date at this point, but you know, they'll give you a better feel. And there's lots of books. Rob particularly has written a number of books after the Transition Handbook that you can check out. Lift each other up. You know, really to share information like Terry and Amy are doing here about transition in permaculture groups. And as I've been doing in transition groups and talking about permaculture and encouraging people to learn more and get more involved in permaculture. We teach the permaculture principles in one of our trainings, relating them to how we can be better community organizers. Find a transition initiative near you. You can go to the International Transition Network website, which I'll put on the screen in a moment, or the Transition US website to see where there are transition initiatives located, possibly near where you live. Here in Florida, the two most active ones at the moment are Transition Sarasota and Transition Venice. And I'm sure they'd be happy to provide some support. But we have 170 official initiatives all over the country and hundreds of Mullers, as we talked about at the outset. We're starting to call them merging initiatives, so they're not quite as, it's not quite as confusing a term. But there's lots of potential of collaboration between permaculture groups and transition groups. And if you don't find one near you, you could start one. And there's lots of resources for teaching you how to start a new transition initiative. We'll be offering another launch round of our transition launch training online starting in August. And that's a great resource for that. One of the things that's really low-hanging fruit for transition initiatives and permaculture groups to do is to partner on workshops and courses. We did that with Transition Sarasota, bringing in permaculture teachers to teach workshops on particular topics. We also hosted the first permaculture design course, and I think still the only one that's ever been held in Sarasota, with our friend Corinne Brennan from Grow Permaculture back in 2012. And transition initiatives can really potentially help to promote your courses to maybe more of a mainstream audience that could benefit from them. And then supporting each other's programs and campaigns as well. So practical projects, we can work on those together. We can develop them together. I know that our board president, Roger Landry, who some of you may know, brought in permaculture designers to help design a food forest for the school where his daughter went, Bay Haven School here in Sarasota. So, trying to talk about things that are eminently doable, that aren't going to require a lot of work on either of our parts, but could be mutually beneficial. And the two websites to remember about transition are transitionnetwork.org, that's the international coordinating body, and transitionus.org, which is where you can find me. So that's all I wanted to say to get this started, and looking forward to some questions and discussion.
Don, thank you so much for spending your time here with us. I actually learned a lot of about transition today, and I've been experienced in the field, so it's really been wonderful to have you here. We had Lisa talked about local economies, and local economies are always one of the points that have really interested me. And one of the best parts I see about what you're doing out there is the time bank over in Sarasota. I was wondering if Transitions is connected to them, and if you could talk a little bit about time banks and how to start one and how it works.
Oh, yeah. So I see Nancy was asking about I will answer that. Nancy was asking about the graphic on the screen, and I did forget to explain that. So I just want to touch on that briefly. So this is from the Northern California Permaculture Convergence, which is actually one of the largest ones in the world. I think there were a few thousand people there last year. And this is the permaculture symbol you see here. And these are the leaves that you see cropping up in a lot of transition logos. So it's about symbiosis between these two movements and about the connection. So I thought that was a nice little thing to include. As for time banks, yeah, there are a number of transition initiatives that have time banks. There's also a lot of time banks that are not affiliated with transition initiatives, that are maybe affiliated with permaculture groups or other groups. So a time bank, for anybody who's unfamiliar, is basically a way for people to exchange services with each other outside of the traditional economy. So we know in our economy that everything is very focused on jobs, jobs, jobs. But we are not just the one thing we do as our job. We have a lot more to offer the world. So, a time bank is typically a website where you can post offers and you can post requests for things that you need, which could be voice lessons if you're a singer. It could be help with weeding your garden. It could be somebody to take care of your dog when you're out of town. And you can do that in other places like Nextdoor or Craigslist or something. But a time bank typically has very different values that it's specifically about neighbors helping neighbors, building a more sustainable and just local community. And everybody's time is valued equally. So 1 hour of my time is exchanged for 1 hour of your time. Or maybe you don't have something that I want. So I will take that time dollar that you gave to me for doing a service, and I'll go spend it with somebody else who has something that I need. So it's fairly easy to set up a time bank and get it started, but the challenge is maintaining its use over time. So the most successful time banks, and there's a pretty successful one up in Tampa. There was Tampa Bay Time, and now there's the St. Pete Time Bank. They do a lot of events to bring new people in, to train people in using the system, to encourage people to post their offers and requests, to build a sense of community. We started one called the Commonwealth Time Bank out of Transition Sarasota here, but it has since fizzled due to just a lack of people who are constantly investing energy in it to keep the momentum going, keep people using it. It's certainly something that could be brought back at any time, but currently it's inactive. So that's a little bit about your question.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's definitely a tool I see as an effective way to bring community together and keep economy local. So thank you for sharing that. I had a question about your experience with why the transition movements fail. What is it in it that really is common that creates opportunities for them to either stop or not be successful?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Transition initiatives do fail. Businesses do fail. Nonprofit organizations fail. Everything ultimately fails. But I think that there's a few things to look out for, particularly in the kind of community organizing that transition does. So one would be how the group is brought together initially. I think that it's very important that transition initiatives are very inclusive. I think that's a key, it is a key value of our movement. We have 8 principles, and inclusion and social justice, diversity are included in those principles. But I also think that not everyone is necessarily immediately suited for, taking leadership for how to design a transition in an entire community. So, we all come with our own baggage. I know I do. But, some people are better than others in terms of strategizing and communicating about this and working together collaboratively with others. So sometimes the approach in starting a transition group is to hold a big meeting and say, who wants to be on the core group? And, maybe you have 75 people there and 30 raise their hands. Now suddenly you have a very large group that is difficult to reach consensus with. And you may have some folks that are there primarily for their own purposes, not to serve the whole. And that can be very difficult if that is how the initiative starts. So what I always suggest is, if you're thinking about this, have conversations with people. See who's interested, see who has skills, see who has good ideas, and invite them to join your initiating group. It doesn't mean that other people can't participate and take leadership in other ways, but you want to start off on the right foot. Second thing is that you want to encourage good group practices. That you want to have some kind of training and practices set up around creating a unified mission and vision that your initiative can steer by, having some group agreements about how we relate to each other, knowing how to make decisions collectively, knowing how to resolve conflicts when they pretty much inevitably arise, and other practices like that. We've been very focused in the transition movement on this topic. We actually offer a training in effective collaboration because this has been such a challenge for a lot of people. You know, we don't necessarily learn these skills from our families. We don't necessarily learn these skills in school or at work. So where do we learn them? There are a number of organizations that have really good training programs. But I think it's something that needs to really be paid attention to. Often we want to just get out there and start doing. But if we don't build strong relationships with each other, if we don't have a clear sense of what are the rules that we're playing by, that we all agree to, then that can often cause the implosion of groups, not just transition groups. So I think those are really two things to keep in mind. And I think the third thing I would say is having realistic expectations. So in the early days of transition, a guy named Richard Heinberg famously said, transition is more like a party than a protest march. And I think that gave people a kind of little bit of a false sense that this was going to be very easy. And of course, changing the world is not going to be easy. It's going to require a lot of ingenuity. It's going to require a lot of learning. It's going to require a lot of persistence. It can be very enjoyable, very meaningful, deeply satisfying. But it also requires that we stick with it and that we continuously evolve our approach, learning from our experiences. So I think that's important too, to not get frustrated, like, why haven't we changed the world yet? We must be doing something wrong. And it's like, no, we still have all the economic forces and the political forces, historical forces working against us. But we need to be patient because these things build over time. You know, you start off with a small group of people, and then that becomes a bigger group of people, and a bigger group of people, and a bigger group of people. As we can prove that our ideas work and really make life better for people everywhere. So I would say those are the three things, especially at the beginning, to pay attention to.
Beautiful, and as always, such detail. We have Kashi Frank asking if there's a training program we could access to teach these social skills, especially during COVID.
Yeah, so we do teach online courses. We find that, you know, that makes them a lot more accessible to people. We also teach in-person courses, but during this time of social distancing, and as we're probably all aware, cases are going up again in Florida. So we still need to be a little bit careful. We will be teaching, and I'll be involved in that, a transition launch training, kind of how to get started with this, beginning on August 13th. Registration should be online on the Transition US website within the next couple weeks. It may be called something different than that. We're playing around with different titles that say, this information has been, you know, this approach has been developed by Transition, but it, you know, can benefit people who are doing all sorts of things, called all sorts of different things. So maybe called something more like regenerative leadership for social change, or we're playing with different titles. So that will start August 13th and run through the end of the year. We'll have live sessions every 2 weeks, 8 sessions. And then I think in September, we're planning to start another round of the effective collaboration training that I mentioned. So that should be on our website sometime in July, opening registration.
Thank you, Don, so much for your time, for your passion, for your energy, and this continued work you've done in the transitions movement. It's truly inspirational. And having witnessed a transition model grow through time, it's exciting work, and I know it's impactful on a community. So thank you very much for being here. And Don has graciously donated 2 copies of the book 10 Stories of Transition in the US, which thank you so much. And we'll be giving those away to 2 people who answer this week's question of why is it important to you for our communities to transition to a regenerative model. And we'll be answering that in our Facebook community page, which Amy will put the link in over there, which brings up my gratitude for Amy. Thank you so much for making this call run so smoothly, for getting all of our thoughts and ideas. I invite everyone to join us in the community page, especially you, Don, to answer some questions, maybe put the links to some of those amazing classes that are coming up. And we're really excited to transition. So this is nice. I want to remind everybody next week's call is going to be really exciting. We're going to be talking about how to design and build a food forest with Matthew Reese. If you don't know Matt Reese, he is a gift to us here in Florida and a true artist in creating food forest systems. So you'll definitely want to be part of that call next week. So we're in a time of transition right now, whether we know it, whether we're involved, we're in a time of transition with racial inequality, with discrimination against people for sexual orientation or religious practices, or corporate greed creating more environmental destruction every day. This is the time for change. And whatever tools we can use to get to this new world of cooperation, I welcome them on my tool belt. So thanks again, Don. Thank you all for joining us in this important topic, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Don.